All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So we're going back to the old format. I told you guys I was going to flip it and go back to the old ways that I used to do these videos, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to get straight into it. This one right here is called Collateral Damage, Hostile Takeover, and it happened in Centinella on D-Yard. And this incident took place sometime around 2011 in Centinella on D-Yard. This was right before everybody would get released from the shoot. I believe that happened 3 or 4 years later, sometime around 2015. But at this time, everybody was still housed in the shoe program. This is also around the time when Weddle Sherm from Shelltown, Weddle Caballo from 18th Street, Sleepy from Westside Weemas, and Popeye from Harpies implemented the new Mesa system. I talked about this before and I broke it all down in one of my past episodes, but these four were considered to be the architects and the pioneers who streamlined this new innovative system. And without going into all the details of it again, these guys basically felt like there were enough qualified sureños out there on the main lines who had the mental stature to run these main lines themselves, instead of waiting for a Mexican Mafia member that was often hundreds of miles away to implement direction that wasn't always in line with what was going on. I mean, it's hard to run a main line from your cell in the shoot program. It can be done, but guys that are out there that are on these main lines that are walking these yards themselves are more suited to handle the day-to-day affairs because they're out there and they're the ones that are encountering whatever's going on out there. A lot of the times when they would get directives from Mexican Mafia members, so a lot of the times when they would get direction from some of these Mexican Mafia members that were in the shoot program, they didn't coincide with what was going on out there, and that created a lot of dissension. So this story, like a lot of the other stories that I've told you guys, has all the usual sinister elements that make for another good Mexican Mafia story. Backstabbing, betrayal, double dealing, cutthroat politics, and deception. All the usual things that happen out there on these main lines. This story right here, this is a good story. However, it's going to be a little bit short-winded than my usual stories because my source, who I'm now going to refer to as Creeper, didn't offer up a lot of the intricate details that I usually try to capture in my stories. But it's still going to be a banger. And like a lot of my stories, at the end, it has a cold twist to it. So again, like I said, my source, who I'm now going to refer to as Creeper, was actually out there on the yard when these events took place. So Creeper, he ended up becoming neighbors with an individual by the name of Drugs from Eastside Longo. I don't know if this was some kind of covert name he was using while he was just on the main line, which happens a lot, or if this was what they actually called him. But this isn't a common name that you hear too often. This is the first time I've heard somebody go by the name of Drugs. And if this guy was trying to be conspicuous, he wasn't flying too low under the radar with a name like Drugs. At any rate, like I said, Drugs was from Eastside Longo, and he had just been transferred from B Yard's overflow to D Yard. They'll override you from either a level 4 to a level 3 or vice versa. You got level 4 guys that are on level 3 yards, but they're literally within a few points of getting down class to a level 3. So this is something that's common. Anyways, I don't know everything that was involved with the transfer when Drugs got transferred to D-Yard, but apparently he knew that he was going to only be over there for a month and that they were going to shoot him back to B-Yard. My guess is that his points were probably going to drop and that he was anticipating being reclassified. However, that's just speculation. I don't know. But he went to D-Yard knowing that he was going to be shot back to B-Yard within a month. Anyways, this individual Drugs had a homeboy named Bird, who was also from Eastside Longo, that had just landed on B-Yard prior to Drugs getting his override. From the sounds of it, Bird was doing too much out there. He was pushing a hard line and they told on him. They got him off the yard. Somebody dropped a kite on him. When you're out there pushing that kind of line and there's either cats that are intimidated or they want to go home, they're going to get you off the yard. However they need to do it. Either the honorable way or the dishonorable way. But either way, they're going to get you off the yard. You got to understand, a lot of these guys don't want to be involved in politics or they don't want to get involved in drama. They want to go home. And if there's individuals out there that are stirring the pot and creating conflict, they're going to get those guys off the yard. And that's what happened to Bird. So at the time, Turi from Cucas was running Centinella. That was his prison and Bird was one of his enforcers. Knowing Turi and how he operates, he probably had Bird out there taxing people, running dough, and generating money however he could. However, again, let me make it clear that Turi was not on the yard with him. This was before everybody came out of the chute. Turi was still housed in Pelican Bay at that time. He was just in charge of Centinella and whatever other prisons that were designated to him. In fact, at that time, Turi was overseeing a massive power base that included several different prisons and several different counties on the streets. He had a lot of influence at that time and he had a lot of status. He was shouldering a lot of responsibility back in 2011, and the Mexican Mafia entrusted him with this responsibility. At that time, whether you had Mexican Mafia members that were still housed in Pelican Bay Shoe, or a few years later when Mexican Mafia members might be housed in New Folsom or Corcoran, this was common practice. A Mexican Mafia member might be housed in New Folsom or Corcoran, but then he'd also be in charge of other prisons as well. It just depended. Like the NF, you have some Mexican Mafia members that are not really leaders and can't really run prisons the way that they're supposed to run. Or they can't generate money like, no, this guy can generate money. So those that were the breadwinners, those are the ones that held a lot of the responsibility. They were the ones that were implementing direction over a lot of these prisons. You know, again, like I said, at the time when this story was taking place, Turi was held in high regard. He had a lot of status. He had a lot of power, and he had established himself as one of the more influential Mexican Mafia members at that time. However, he would eventually find himself in hot water, and he was placed on disregard behind his own indiscretions. But a few years later, I'm not sure exactly what the time frame was, with the assistance of Mexican Mafia members like Chato from Arizona Maravilla, he was cleared and brought back into the fold. And I think a lot of that had to do with Turi himself and how he functioned as a Mexican Mafia member. He was a loyalist. He believed in the Mexican Mafia. And when he was put on disregard status, he refused to lock it up. And I believe that these were factors that helped bring him back. So again, Turi was technically in charge of Centinella at that time in 2011, but he appointed an understudy that worked directly under him, basically a mouthpiece. You can call him an understudy, a buffer, an underling. It's all the same. Someone who works directly under him and basically acts as his mouthpiece. This ended up being a guy from the Hawaiian Gardens who went by the name Speedy. So Speedy was running the yard for Turi and he was facilitating all his directives. Everybody knew that Speedy was in charge of that prison, but they also knew that he was acting under the direction of Turi from Cucas. So at some point, Bird catches wind that his homeboy Drugs was getting ready to catch that override to D-Yard, the yard he had just came from. And Bird sees this as an opportunity to tie up some loose ends and to facilitate whatever communications he needed to. You know, when someone drops a kite on you and their whole purpose is to get you off the yard, 9 times out of 10, you just get snatched up. You don't have an opportunity to tie up your loose ends or to tap in with the people that you need to tap in with before you leave that yard. You just get snatched up unexpectedly. So I imagine somebody like Bird that was operating out there on the yard for Turi probably had a lot of drugs, a lot of money, and there was a lot of things, a lot of direction that he was implementing that was still in the process that he needed to follow up on. So this was his opportunity to do it through drugs. He knew Drugs was going to D-Yard and he was going to send him over there with a kite. So what ended up happening is Bird, he strikes this kite up. He strikes it up and he basically covers everything he needs to cover in this one time. Once he's done striking up the kite, he gives it to Drugs and he tells him, he's like, hey homie, you're going over there to D-Yard. I need you to get this one time to Speedy from Hawaiian Gardens. But when he gives it to Drugs, he gives it to him unwrapped and he tells him, but I need you to read it. I need you to put eyes on it to verify everything that I'm covering in this one time. And I need you to validate this. Just in case this becomes an issue later, I have someone that can validate and legitimize everything that I'm telling Speedy in this one time. This is also common practice within the Sureño collective. This is something that I learned myself since I've been doing these stories. I don't remember what story it was, but basically there was a story where there was a Sureño that came from the back from an ad seg, and he came out with a kite. This kite was supposed to be hand delivered to another Sureño out on the yard. He had clear-cut directives to make a beeline from ad seg to that individual he was supposed to hand deliver this one time to. He wasn't supposed to give it to anybody else. Nobody else was to know about it. This was something that was being done under tight wraps. Nobody was supposed to know about it, because the fear at the time was that if people on the yard found out about it, they would stop this hit from going down. But this is when I found out that when a situation like this arises, you'll have a sureño that will come out with a kite like that, and he'll go to somebody trustworthy, somebody that he knows, a reputable sureño out there, and they'll tell him, hey, I need you to read this so that you can confirm everything that is in this kite. You can confirm that this kite is saying that this individual is to be whacked, and you see it's coming from the back, and this is a way of covering his ass. So this was basically the same concept in this scenario right here. Bird wanted Drugs to read the one time. He wanted to make sure that he understood everything that he was telling Speedy. Again, this was a way to cover himself and to validate the legitimacy of that kite. You know, from my understanding, from everything that my source told me about Drugs, Drugs was the type of individual, was a real humble dude, real respectful, humble dude that tried to avoid conflict, tried to avoid being caught up in politics, minded his own business, and, you know, tried to stay low key. That's the kind of individual he was. He had a lot of respect on the yard from the other sureños. Anytime something needed to be done, as far as, you guys see that, that's my boy Chewy right there. Anytime a removal or something like that needed to be done, he would never debate it. He would never question it. He would just ask when, where, and point me in the right direction. So we had a lot of respect out there on the yard. But being that him and Bird were real close and that Bird was relying on his assistance to help him get this done, Drugs agreed to hand deliver this kite to Speedy. So now fast forward a few days or about a week, long enough for Drugs to get transferred to D-Yard. So when Drugs finally gets transferred and he lands on D-Yard, he ends up moving into a cell with a lifer by the name of Shady, who was also from Westside Longo. Drugs was from Eastside Longo, but they basically rocked together on the streets. So this ended up being an ideal situation. So like I said, Shady was a lifer. He had been in Centinella for about 4 or 5 years when Drugs ended up moving into his cell. When Drugs moved into the cell with them, he sat down with Shady, and Shady basically went over everything that was happening on the yard. He basically gave him a pass down of everything that was happening out there, as far as the politics, who was in charge, who was doing what, who was pushing drugs, who was creating conflict out there, everything he needed to know in order to function on that yard. And like I said, according to Creeper, my source, Drugs and Shady ended up being super cool. They ended up hitting it off, and they were good cellies. I told you guys before, it's hard to find a good cellie. It doesn't matter if somebody's from your neighborhood. It doesn't matter if you know them from the streets. I've seen dudes that know each other from the streets, and they're tight, but they can't live together. They can't be in a cell together because they're not compatible. Either somebody's stuck in their ways, or this guy has bad hygiene habits, or there's something that just makes them incompatible. You can't have two lions in the same cell. You can only have one aggressive dude in the cell. There has to be one that's kind of passive, that doesn't really trip off of too much. Otherwise, they're gonna end up bumping heads. But being that Shady was a lifer, he'd already been down a few years, he knew how to do time, they hit it off, and they got along good. So at some point, when they're in the cell, you got a good cellie, keep them abreast of everything that's going on. They're in the cell, Drugs is getting situated. He advises Shady that he's got a one time that he needs to get to Speedy from Hawaiian Gardens. They talk about it, they kick it around, they talk about Speedy. Shady tells Drugs what Speedy's been doing out there on the yard, but they ultimately agree to go to the yard the following day to find Speedy and to hand deliver that kite to him. So that's what they did. The following day, they go out to the yard. Shady points Speedy out. Drugs approaches him. He tells him, hey, I got a one time that needs to be hand delivered to you. Here it is, and he smashes off. So this is where it started to get interesting. After Drugs gives Speedy the kite, later on that day or the following day, my source, Creeper, he notices that Speedy starts rallying up his troops. They start grouping up, and for whatever reason, they all start mean mugging Drugs. So they start mad dogging Drugs and anybody that he starts associating with, including Shady. At the time, Creeper didn't know what was going on. He had no idea that Drugs had hand delivered that kite to Speedy. He didn't know, obviously he didn't know the contents of the kite. All he knew is that there was some kind of conflict out there. Like I said, Speedy started rallying up his troops. He got his team together and they started grouping out there. And this was all done to flex, to basically show some force out there on the yard, to show that they had some numbers out there. And, you know, Speedy wanted it to be known that he had a big following out there. guys that were supporting him, some reputable sureños that were basically manipulated by him. So it's obvious that whatever Bird wrote in that kite, the contents of that kite, that was the reason why Speedy was mean mugging drugs. It was merely by association. But keep in mind, whatever it said, Drugs had read it, so he was well aware of everything that was going on. You know, one of the things that I've noticed about a lot of these stories, especially on the level 3 and 4 yards, is that the sureños are more often than not divided. They're broken up into different cars. And a lot of the times, there's power plays going on out there. They're vying for control of the yard. I'm not saying that this stands true on all yards, but I've definitely seen a good number of them that are. There's just something that keeps them divided, whether it's politics, bad leadership, the presence of tyranny. I've seen this in quite a few of the stories that I've told you guys about, and this yard was no different. There was dissension on the yard, as there was a lot of sureños out there that didn't agree with some of the bully tactics that Speedy and some of the others that were working under him were deploying on that yard. But the bully tactics were only a part of it. It was the whole political push that was being implemented by Turi and his minions that they weren't feeling. To say that they were discouraged would be an understatement. So like I told you guys, Drugs had a lot of respect out there. He was considered to be a stand-up sureño. Again, he minded his own business. He was known to be extremely loyal, and he always did what was expected of him. That's respectable. So when a lot of the other sureños that were out there on the yard seen the whole power play that Speedy and his crew were getting ready to put on Drugs, they came out to show some support in big numbers. Creeper, my source, he even said that he personally approached Drugs and asked him if he was good. And being the stand-up kind of guy that Drugs was, not wanting to see a power struggle escalate, Drugs basically told Creeper that he was good and he had it covered. But the more important thing that came out of that conversation is that Speedy, he peeped the whole move. He seen Creeper approach Drugs on the yard, and it was also obvious that Drugs had a lot of support out there. You know, Creeper was another sureño that had a lot of influence out there. And Speedy knew that if it came down to it, Creeper could pose a threat. You know, at the conclusion of their conversation, the conversation between Drugs and Creeper, Drugs basically told Creeper, I'll holler at you later. I'll fill you in on everything that's going on. But he referred to Speedy as a thief. And he basically said, fuck him and the agenda that them dudes are on. Creeper didn't know what that meant at that time. But later on, Drugs would fill him in. So now, fast forward about another week. Tension on the yard is just continue to escalate. They're still grouping. Everybody's kind of divided. And everybody's just kind of waiting around to see what's going to happen, what's going to kick off. Speedy hadn't pushed the issue at that point by approaching Drugs and addressing him. At that time, all he was doing was just mean mugging him. They were posturing. There was a lot of grouping. That's all he was doing. It was just a show of force. Drugs, on the other hand, was trying to do everything he could from seeing this escalate. He was trying to avoid seeing a power struggle out there on the yard. He didn't want to see sureños going at other sureños. That was something that he really didn't want to see. They had other enemies out there to deal with, but they didn't need another war out there between good sureños. But at the same time, even though he didn't want to see that conflict escalate, he started to realize that Speedy's presence was detrimental to the rest of the yard. That dude had to go. So a little over a week after Drugs hand delivered that kite to Speedy, Drugs went to Creeper's cell and asked him if he could assist him with the banger. He didn't offer up what it was for. He didn't tell him why he needed it. He just said, look, bro, I need a banger. Can you assist me with one? Keep in mind, Creeper and Drugs were neighbors, so they were housed in the same building. So Creeper, he doesn't probe. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't ask him why he needs the piece. But during this same conversation, Drugs proceeded to tell Creeper what was going on and why the kite created the kind of reaction that it did. So the kite that Bird sent to Speedy was actually a message that was coming directly from Turi from Cucas. This was coming from Turi himself. And unbeknownst to everybody on that yard, including everybody that was loyal to Speedy, Speedy had actually turned rogue and was stealing from the Mexican mafia. Turi's message verbatim said, who's the dead man that has been taking gold from the leprechaun? And it's obvious what this metaphor was saying. Turi was asking Speedy, who's stealing my money? And whoever it is going to suffer fatal consequences. In another portion of the letter, Turi stated verbatim, that house is dirty. And if it don't get cleaned up, I'm going to send in the landscapers to chop down the weeds. This was another coded metaphor that was basically telling Speedy, look, you guys are dirty over there. You guys are stealing money. There's trash on the yard. If you don't get right, I'm going to send some hitters to knock down those who are accountable. Basically, that if things don't get back in order, somebody's going to suffer some consequences. And that somebody was Speedy. What Speedy was basically doing was he was collecting Thuri's money and he was sending it to his big homie from Hawaiian Gardens. I don't know if the reference big homie meant somebody that was influential from his neighborhood, from the Hawaiian Gardens, or if the reference big homie was another Mexican mafia member. That wasn't made clear to me. My source didn't clarify that, but the way I took it was that it was somebody from his neighborhood, somebody from Hawaiian Gardens. It wasn't another Mexican mafia member. This was just one of his personal homeboys that had a lot of influence, somebody who he obviously looked up to. Either way, Speedy obviously thought that he could bilk money from Thuri's operation based solely on the fact that Thuri wasn't there to see the money coming in himself. This was a big oversight and a bad mistake, one that I've seen others make as well, and it never turned out good for those individuals at the end. They assume that they can steal money here and there because they assume that there's not eyes that are constantly watching them. Thuri might not have been there to oversee things himself, but that doesn't mean he didn't recruit others to watch out for these types of things for him. Granted, nothing's completely foolproof. You can only do so much to protect your investments, but contingency plans are always in effect and traps are always being set to flush out guys like Speedy. I'm not sure exactly how Thuri ended up finding out. That was something else that wasn't clarified, but Thuri was seeing red and he wanted somebody held accountable. And again, being familiar with how this all works, there's only one individual that could be held accountable, and that's Speedy. He's the one that's responsible for sending that money to Thuri. He's the one that's responsible for implementing his direction. He's the one that's responsible for being his mouthpiece. So he's the one that is going to be held accountable. He can't shift the blame to anybody else. So the following day after Creeper and Drugs had that conversation about the kite and everything that escalated behind it, they ran the normal day room program in that building. That's basically when they pop everybody's doors, they let them come out on the tier, they let them shower, watch a little bit of TV, use the phones, and basically it's time that they have to socialize in the building. So according to Creeper, he's seen Drugs go down to a shower that's designated as being one of the Sureños showers. And nothing looked out of the ordinary. He had seen him do this many times in the past. However, when Drugs was in the shower, he apparently ended up spotting two Long Beach insane Crips that were his mortal enemies on the streets. They were in a cell right next to the shower. So these two Crips, they're in the cell right there next to the shower. They're in their cell. They're drinking wine, they're feeling themselves, they got their rap music bumping, and they're just doing their thing. But Creeper said it was obvious that these guys were obviously drunk. They were feeling their liquor. And again, Creeper didn't know what was going on. He just kind of sensed something based off of Drugs' body language. So he posted up on the upper tier and he kind of just kept an eye out on Drugs. So when Drugs comes out the shower, he dries himself off, he gets dressed, he looks up to Creeper, he flags him down, he motions to come down there to where he's at. So when Creeper makes his way down there where Drugs was at, Drugs asks Creeper if he has a banger on him. And, at that time, it was mandatory for Sureños, at least on that yard, to always have anywhere from 3 to 5 bangers accessible anytime they were out programming, whether it was on the yard or in the building. And Creeper just so happened to be one of those Sureños that was designated to carry a banger. Again, Creeper, he doesn't ask no questions. He's not the type of Sureño that, meddles into other people's business. He understands how politics work. You don't ask a lot of questions. It's not always acceptable. So he doesn't really say nothing. He hands his banger off to Drugs and he just posts up. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He just kind of stands there and waits to see what happens next. So at this point, Drugs, he tells Creeper, he's like, hey, homie, he's like, I'm good. Go ahead and handle your business. He's like, I got this. So Creeper's like, you sure, bro? He's like, if you need me, I got you. And Drugs tells him, nah. He's like, I got a wingman, bro. Don't trip. He's like, go ahead and go about your business. So as Creeper starts to walk away, he hears Drugs call another individual named Clever from Pasadena Latin Kings. He calls Clever and he tells him, he's like, hey, homie, I need you to ride with me real quick. He's like, I'm about to get at these Africanos. And I just need somebody to hear how I'm going to get at these individuals to make sure that, it's known that I'm approaching them respectable and that I'm not getting at them foul. So Clever agrees to walk over there with them. That's also another common policy. Whenever they approach an enemy and there's any kind of conflict, or whenever they're talking to a CO, a lot of the times they'll have another Sureño accompany them to be another set of ears right there that can confirm everything that's being said. So again, this was Drugs covering his ass. He wanted a witness that could attest to how he was getting at these guys just in case things went sideways. So later on, Drugs would basically tell Creeper what happened with those two Crips. Drugs said that when he was in the shower, these two Crips put a song on by the East Siders. And this particular song had disrespectful lyrics that were directed at Long Beach Sureños. The song said something to the effect of, I got an extra clip for the Pinche Longueros, the Long Beach Sureños. And apparently when they got to this particular part of the song, they continued to rewind it and play it, rewind it and play it, so that that part of the song could be heard by Drugs. At least in his mind, this is what he thought. This is what he was saying. They just continue to keep playing the song over and over. So Drugs and Clever, they walk over to the cell, and Drugs, he taps on the window. He knocks on the window and he gets the attention of these two Crips, and he flags one of them down. He motions them to come to the window. So one of them gets up, he walks over to the window and he's like, what's up? And according to Drugs, he respectfully says something to the effect of, what's up, homeboy? You're obviously feeling good, right? Well, I'm from Long Beach and we both know what's going on. But if you're feeling some type of way, come holler at me when they open up the doors for unlock and we'll figure out what's good. Then Drugs walked away. He said the Crip didn't even respond. He just stood there listening to him, but he didn't respond. So Drugs and Clever walked away. So right after this confrontation, Drugs makes a beeline to his cell. He goes to his cell for the purpose of letting Shady know what just happened. And that's what he's supposed to do. Anytime you have a cellie and you get into any kind of conflict, whether it's just verbal or whether it gets physical, you're always supposed to put your cellie on notice, because there's always that possibility that whoever you're in conflict with, they could bring that back to your cell, and your cellie ends up getting victimized and blindsided because he doesn't know what's going on. So Drugs goes up there, he tells Shady what's up, and Shady's also got a banger on him. So they both post up and just wait for the doors to pop open to see what's going to happen next. But during the time when Drugs was on his way to his cell to put Shady on notice, Clever makes a beeline for Speedy's cell. He basically goes over there and he tells Speedy everything that happened. He didn't put no extras on it or nothing like that. He just basically gives him a heads up and he tells him, hey, Drugs just got into a verbal confrontation with these two Crips. So boom, a few minutes later, the doors pop open. As soon as the doors pop open, one of the Crips comes out of the cell and he also makes a beeline for Speedy's cell. This Crip goes over there and he tells Speedy, he's like, hey, check this out, man. One of your homies just got at me foul. He basically told me to go strap up, to go get my weapon. So he threatened me. Now, obviously, according to Drugs, that's not what happened. Later on, he would say that this Crip flipped it and he lied. He lied about, what was said. But Clever was there. And even though he backed up Drugs' version, Speedy was still mad at Drugs. Speedy was furious. He was already looking for a reason to get Drugs off the yard. So he started to push the issue. And this was not only because of the kite situation. This was also because Speedy knew that Drugs had the goods on him. He knew about the stolen money. And as long as he was out there, he was a threat to Speedy. But instead of Speedy approaching Drugs and confronting him about this himself, Speedy goes to another Sureño by the name of Tito from Norwalk. And he basically tells Tito to tell Drugs to keep his fucking mouth shut and to shut the fuck up. Those were the words he used verbatim. So Drugs looked at Tito and he said, check this out, OG. You go ahead and tell Speedy that he might talk to his homeboys like that and they might accept it because they're scared of him. According to Creeper, there's no question about the fact that Tito relayed this back to Speedy. However, Speedy doesn't respond. It's crickets. He doesn't say nothing. And the reason he didn't say nothing is because it wasn't in his best interest. I think there was a part of Speedy that was intimidated by Drugs. He was intimidated by him. That's why he was sending other people at him. I could be wrong, but just from an outside perspective, that's the way it looks to me. So from that point on, the plot only thickens. Now, the following day, there was another lifer named Harpo from V&E who was out on the tier making his runs. He was doing his rounds, getting people hot water, I think he was a porter in the building. So when Harpo makes his way to Drugs and Shady's door, he knocks on the window and he motions for Shady to come to the door. Harpo says, "Hey, Drugs, what's up, homie?" And the homie wants to know if you'll participate in the removal. He doesn't specify who the homie is, but it's obvious that he's referring to Speedy. Drugs, he kind of laughs. He just kind of laughs and says, "Yeah, I'll participate. Who is it?" So Harpo tells him it's an older cat who goes by the name of Bad Boy from the Hangout Boys. And apparently Bad Boy was at another prison and he refused to go to the yard when he knew a riot was going to pop off. And coincidentally, his cellie ended up getting hurt in that riot. So they looked at that as an act of cowardice. They basically held him accountable for that and they put a green light on him. So after Harpo propositioned Drugs about participating in this holiday, Drugs tells Harpo, "Check it out, Harpo. I'm not dumb or stupid. I know what this is really about. So you tell Speedy that the only way that I'm going to participate in this removal is if I'm the shooter and if I pick my own cleanup crew." After Drugs lays all this out, Harpo says, "Okay, I'll go run it by the homie and see what he says." With that said, he left. Needless to say, Harpo never comes back. And again, the one thing that Creeper kept on reiterating is that Drugs had a lot of influence on that yard. A lot of the Sureños respected him and they had his back. So after that conversation with Harpo, Drugs basically let a lot of his homies on that yard know what time it was. He basically let it be known that Speedy and the Mesa, his team, his crew that were out there on the yard, were basically trying to run him over and they were trying to cross him up. Again, Drugs' whole purpose wasn't to see a power struggle erupt out there on the yard. He was trying to avoid that, but it was becoming obvious that Speedy was backing him into a corner. So Drugs was just trying to make sure that everybody out there on the yard knew what was going on. And he was standing up for himself. That's what this was about. Again, this is cutthroat politics in play right here. This is another classic example of it. You got a solid Sureño that's being politicked against by someone like Speedy who has a foul agenda. So fast forward again. That same week, a couple days later, an individual by the name of Chato gets transferred to that yard. He lands on that yard coming from Pelican Bay. Creeper didn't specify what Chato he was referring to, or he didn't give me his hood. However, I believe it might have either been Chato from Baldwin Park or Chato from Arizona Maravilla. I could be wrong, but I know both of these individuals had done time up in the Bay and both of them had a lot of influence. So according to Creeper, Drugs, he approaches Chato and he basically runs everything down to him. Chato is somebody that's been around. Chato told him that he was going to try to find a loophole insofar as how to deal with this, but in the meantime, just to continue standing his ground and to continue doing what he's been doing. So Creeper said that for the next 2 weeks after Chato told Drugs, to hold his ground and to continue doing what he was doing, whatever that meant, that Speedy and his crew just continued to keep trying to press Drugs to participate in that removal. And every time they would approach him or they would have somebody approach him, Drugs just kept countering with his position about being the shooter and finding his own cleanup crew. He made it clear that that's the only way he was going to do it. I don't know what the issue was or why there was any kind of conflict about Drugs being the shooter. If Speedy wanted to get him off the yard, that's all that should have mattered. Whether he was the shooter or part of the cleanup crew was irrelevant. But for whatever reason, Speedy didn't want Drugs to be the shooter. Speedy wanted to assign his own shooter. I don't know, maybe Drugs felt like he'd be exposing himself to one of Speedy's hand-selected shooters if he participated as part of the cleanup crew. In other words, maybe he felt like the shooter that Speedy was gonna pick would have been a threat to him if he allowed him to get too close with the banger. You guys understand what I'm trying to say? Or that Speedy was trying to murk two birds with one stone. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's what happened. Needless to say, the whole mess-up became furious with Drugs' position. They felt like he was bucking the system, that he wasn't following directives out there. So they devised a sneaky plan to try to get Drugs off the yard. Creeper's exact words were, "These sneaky motherfuckers went up to an older homeboy that had the harbor area card." This guy was running the harbor area card. And this individual was described as being a hardcore dope fiend. But nonetheless, he was still running the harbor area car out there on that yard. To be more specific, he was actually from Westside Wimas and they called him Pollo. So the deal of the proposition was this. They told Pollo, look, if you can get drugs to agree to go on this removal with you, and if he accomplishes this, that they'll bless him with a good issue of carga. They'll give him some dough. So they got this guy's nose wide open. I'm sure at that point, Pollo wasn't thinking about nothing but the dough, the clavo, so that he can get loaded. So by this time, Speedy also became aware of the fact that Chato was also supporting drugs and that he was part of the problem. He wasn't part of the solution. And because of this, Pollo was told to get at Chato and to persuade Chato into talking drugs and participating in this removal. With that said, Chato apparently felt pressured. He felt pressured. He felt like he was being backed into a corner. He didn't want to get caught up in this conflict himself, so he basically conceded. He gets at drugs and he tells him, hey homie, I think the best course of action is for you to participate in this removal. Otherwise, things might end up getting crazy. It might get out of hand, and I don't want to see nothing happening. And let me just say this, after hearing this, I'm gonna have to concede on something that I said earlier. Up until I heard about Chato taking this position, I thought it really was either Chato from Baldwin Park or Chato from Arizona Maravilla. But after hearing how Chato backpedaled, I know for a fact it wasn't one of these two individuals. So this was another Chato that they were talking about. I don't know where he was from, but it wasn't either one of the two that I initially thought it was. And I say that because I know for a fact that neither one of these two dudes would have ever allowed themselves to be pressured like that, nor would they ever have taken up the position that he did. Both of these dudes were strong-minded dudes. They had a lot of influence. And if anything, in that situation, Speedy would have been the one told to stand down. So when Chato approaches drugs and, he tells drugs that he thinks he should participate in this removal, Drugs just looks at him and he can't believe what he's hearing. Drugs basically looks at him and he says, wow, homeboy, politics really made you forget where you came from. Drugs then goes on to say, okay, check it out. I'm going to participate in this removal. But after that, I don't want none of you homies from the harbor area ever telling anybody that you ever associated or interacted with me in any kind of way, shape, or form, because I don't want nothing to do with any of you. With that said, Drugs walked off, went to his cell, packed up his property, shaved his head, put on his boots, and posted up by his door, waiting for the next unlock. So when the doors pop open, Drugs comes walking out on the tier. He walks by Creeper's cell and he hands him a small package and he tells him, all right, my boy, here you go. Here's a little something for all my appreciation. You showed me love since I've been here. And with that said, he continued to walk out of the building. When Creeper asked Drugs where he was going, Drugs said, when the heat is on, you gotta eliminate the threat. Creeper said he kind of nodded at Drugs, letting them know that he agreed with them. And then he looked at the package and it ended up being 4 solid grams of carga. So by this time they had opened up the yard and dudes were funneling out of all the buildings going out to the main yard. At that point, Creeper knew that Drugs was up to something. So he makes his way out to the yard. When he gets out there, he starts scanning the yard looking for Drugs and he finally spots him by the handball courts. So he's looking over there in that direction and he sees Speedy on the handball court. At first he had a fleeting thought that, damn, Drugs is gonna whack Speedy. He's gonna take flight on him right now. But that's not what happens. They engage in a short conversation. Obviously, with Creeper being across the yard, he can't hear the specifics of that conversation, but he's watching them and he sees at one point that Speedy tried to reach his hand out to shake Drugs' hand, and Drugs turned around and just walked away. You know, Drugs wasn't a dummy, nor was he gonna allow anybody, including Speedy, to think that he could be manipulated. So from there, Drugs makes a beeline to a gate where he was met by his would-be partners in crime, Giant from Ote and another individual that Creeper described as just being a dumbass resident who was trying to earn brownie points. And the reason why they were posted up in that area is because Bad Boy was due to come out of work exchange at any given minute. If you guys remember, work exchange is similar to an airport security checkpoint, where your carry-on baggage is sent through an x-ray machine, and then you're either scanned with a handheld metal detector or you walk through that big body image scanner before being processed through. I've talked about this before in one of my other stories. Work exchange is an area that's basically designated as a high-risk contraband entry point, or where contraband is more prone to being smuggled into the yard. It could be vocational training, or it could be some kind of job. It's basically an area where weapon stock is always being smuggled onto the yard. So at some point, Bad Boy comes through work exchange. They take the handheld metal detector, they wand him down, and they x-ray whatever he was carrying. So he walks through the gate and he enters the yard. When Drugs and the other two get a visual on Bad Boy, they didn't waste no time. Giant from Ote, obviously with a name like Giant, he was probably a big dude, was the one that approached Bad Boy first. He approaches Bad Boy, and as soon as he gets within reach, he just starts bombing on him. He takes flight on him. You got, you guys got me J-catting off. So Giant, he gets on him, and the resident, he comes in and he starts trying to get on him. But according to Creeper, this dude was just in the way. He wasn't really doing nothing. He tried, but according to Creeper, he was just swinging crazy and he just looked unorthodox out there. He wasn't really serving a purpose. Drugs, he ends up flanking this dude. He ends up barreling into him from the back and he gets on him too. But Drugs had a banger. He starts plugging this dude. So now they're on him. When Drugs hit him from the back, they all went down. So now they're on top of him and they're working this dude. So they get about a good 3 minutes of free money. In other words, the gunner was asleep. Nobody's seen what was happening over there in that area. They're mopping this dude up. Drugs is sticking this dude until one of the gunners looks over in that area, sees what's happening, and hits the alarm. But here's the kicker. So once the alarm goes off, Drugs looks around and Giant and this other resident, they both disappeared. They both took off and left Drugs by himself. Even Creeper said that he was looking over in that area. He was watching everything, but he was also trying to watch the gun towers to see, make sure that the homie didn't get shot. But that when he looked back at some point, he noticed that Giant and that resident had taken off. They left Drugs by himself. Later on, Creeper said that he had a chance to talk to Drugs about everything that happened. And Drugs told him that, when the alarm went off and he realized that Giant and that resident took off, he realized that this was all part of the plan. That these fools wanted to see him get busted and taken off the yard by himself. And that this was more than likely Speedy's plan all along. He said he was like, oh man, these fools are some dirty motherfuckers. They want to see me get taken off the yard by myself. But when Drugs peeps the move, he has like a split second to react. So he looks over to his left and he sees a small group of paisas that had been playing pinochle at one of the tables. And by this time, the whole yard is proned out. Everybody's laying on their stomachs. The gunners had already shot a couple of warning shots and the alarm's going off. So what Drugs does is he crawls over to where these paisas are at and he tries to blend in with them. And when he gets over there, one of the paisas, he actually threw him a small stack of cards to make it look like he was part of that game, that pinochle game. And that one of the other paisas threw him a shirt so that he could wipe some of the blood off. And that's what happened. That's what he did. And this ended up being a blessing in disguise. So by this time, the yard was being flooded by COs coming from other yards, inside the buildings. They were running over to that area where they'd hit Bad Boy. And when they got to that area, they honed in on Giant and that resident. Apparently, one of the COs must have got a visual on these two. They seen that they were involved, so they cuffed them up and they snatched them up off the yard. Drugs actually ended up getting away. So after this incident, according to Creeper, they only went on lockdown for 1 day and then they resumed normal program. And the one thing that Creeper said became visibly obvious is that Speedy was furious. When he found out that Drugs had got away, he went apeshit. Because again, it was to his advantage to get Drugs off the yard. As long as he was out there, he continued to be a threat to Speedy. In fact, there was a Crip named Goodrich from the Rolling 60s that Drugs was real cool with. They had known each other from the county jail, and they had always maintained an open line of communication. Speedy was so flustered about Drugs still being on the yard that he began to lose his composure. Goodrich ended up telling Drugs that he overheard Speedy telling one of the Crips that basically was running the Crips car, "Don't trip, I give you my word, we're gonna get him off the yard by this week." So fast forward 4 days later, guess what happens? When conventional methods don't work, unconventional methods become the solution. On the 4th day, one of the sergeants that was working that watch approaches Drugs' cell, and he basically tells Drugs, "Pack your property, you're getting transferred back to B yard." This is a good example of dirty politics. Speedy got caught at his own game, and in the end, after politicking against Drugs, someone who was respected as a stand-up type of guy, he resorts to the unthinkable, using the canines to do his dirty work. In all fairness, I do have to say that there was never any solid proof that Speedy or any of his crew ever dropped a kite on Drugs, or that they were ever working with the administration to get him off the yard. But according to Creeper, it was obvious based on the totality of everything that was involved. Aside from Speedy proving himself to be a tyrant and somebody who was obviously out for his own personal gain, the other thing that was just as discouraging to Creeper, if not more, was the fact that Speedy took an outsider's word over his own people. That being one of the Long Beach Insane Crips that this all started over. Speedy elected to take his word over a fellow Sureños, and that left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths out there on the yard. Speedy lost a lot of influence, but karma always has a way of coming back full circle and meting out some of the same inflictions that you sometimes inflict on others. About 3 weeks later, after Drugs was moved back to B yard, one of the COs that was conducting one of his routine counts found Speedy unresponsive on the floor in his cell. He was later pronounced dead as the result of acute medicinal poisoning. In other words, an overdose. So Creeper wanted to get this story out for 2 reasons. One, because he thinks it's important that youngsters who still glorify this lifestyle see how politics are really played out there on these yards, and that it's not everything that it's made up to be. But more importantly, this was one of the first times that he's seen one of his fellow Sureños stand up for himself. And according to him, Drugs wasn't a big guy. He was actually small in stature, covered with tattoos, but he was a real respectful and humble dude. Hopefully this story will cause a few more light bulbs to go off, and some of you will see the treachery within this lifestyle. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank all of you for tapping in and for continuing to support the channel. As this one goes out, I'm already working on the next one. I also hope you guys like this format better. Like I said on my live last night, hopefully I'll be able to pump out more content like this. On that note there, you guys enjoy the rest of your week and continue to push that positivity. With that said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.